Hello, BookTube. I inadvertently stumbled into doing a week of comic book related videos, even though nobody watches them and nobody likes them. And I thought I'd finish out the week, since if I was in for a penny, I was in for a pound. I thought I'd finish out the week on Sunday by doing a Super Sunday and concentrating on the greatest comic book superhero of them all, Superman. We are looking here at Superman number 139 from 1960. When my great-grandfather must have been a wee teenager. And this is the life of Super-Merman? What? There is the cover. Longtime Superman fans immediately recognize the mermaid on the cover. That is Lori Lemaris. Superman was never fond of any woman who didn't have initials that were LL. She is a mermaid that a young Superman meets and falls passionately in love with. But she becomes betrothed to a merman from her own undersea kingdom. And so she remains the one that got away for Superman. And here on the cover, Lois Lane is watching as a Superman dives into the ocean to finally be with Lori Lemaris. Lois is thinking, Superman and Lori will be happy together in the underwater world of Atlantis. I've lost him forever. Superman is saying, goodbye, Lois. I've changed myself into a merman so I can join my beloved mermaid and her people under the sea. And the story starts off with Lois and Clark as reporters for the Daily Planet, motoring out to the luxurious yacht of, what is his name? Well, he's a multimillionaire, and his name is Brett. And he was a high school friend of Lois Lane's, but now he's become one of the wealthiest men in the world. And the Daily Planet's editor, Perry White, has told Clark Kent and Lois Lane to go out to his yacht to interview him. There he is. You can just make him out there with his little pocket square, telling them that the skipper will load their bags. While Lois is fixing her, putting her clothes in her cabin, Clark Kent gets a rude surprise from Brett, who tells Clark that I intend to ask Lois Lane to marry me. I hope she accepts me. I'll let you in on a little secret, Kent. I asked Perry White to have you and Lois interview me so I could get a chance to propose to her. Since I'm the planet's biggest advertiser, Perry could hardly refuse. And then we meet them at dinner, where Lois is saying, Brett, tell me something. You were so poor and had to work your way through college. How did you become one of the wealthiest men in the world? And again, when you're reading this story, you are not supposed to say, you couldn't call her on the phone? You're the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest men in the world. You couldn't, I don't know, ask her out on a date, find her at her apartment, that sort of thing, buy her a house. Instead, you've got to finagle an interview with her editor. It's an invitation for you to think that Brett might be something of a schmuck, although it's not an open indication of that. You're allowed to think that. When they go up on deck, he says, see that island? I own it. I also own 5 banks and 10 steel mills. But Lois, riches mean nothing to me. Unless you will marry me. It was you who inspired me to fight my way to the top. I did it to be worthy of your love. And Clark is eavesdropping. Why he has to eavesdrop around a corner where he could be easily stumbled into when he has super hearing and supervision is beyond me. But he's thinking, how can Lois refuse his proposal? Brett Rand has fame, money, and good looks. But Lois does refuse. She can't because there's only one man for her. And Brett says, I know, Superman. Why don't you forget him? He'll never marry you. And Lois says, what you say may be true, but you can't blame a girl for trying, and I'll always keep trying. And then Clark is still watching. He's still listening to all of this. And the next morning, this yacht is apparently they're trawling, they're fishing. They don't have a chef on board. They're fishing, and they catch Lori Lemaris, the mermaid. They just catch her in their net. So they're fishing for their food. They don't have a restaurant or a kitchen on board. And Lori Lemaris just happens to be nearby, a boat that has Superman on it, and she's swimming near the surface and can't avoid a net. Notice that all of the actual fishies have avoided the net, but Lori Lemaris, who presumably has a bigger brain than they do, does not. She gets caught in the net. Superman dives off to rescue her. Says, "I know you can read minds, Lori. Do not be afraid. Superman, your old sweetheart, is on his way to help you." He frees her from the net, uh, and carries her out of the water in full view of the captain, the crew, and Lois. And Superman says out loud, "Lori, it's wonderful to see you again. You're more beautiful than ever. I've never forgotten our romance." And although readers are familiar with Lori Lemaris, Lois Lane is not. This is the first time she knows the reason she now jumps to the conclusion that the reason why Superman has never actually accepted any of her affection is because his heart belongs to another. She thinks how adoringly he's looking at her. So there has been a woman in his life, a mermaid whom he loved. I never knew. Is she the reason he never proposed to me? Then Lori has not spoken. She sits on the rail and Superman starts taking her picture with a camera. It's not his camera. You can't hide a camera on skin-tight leotards. You must borrow it from somebody. He says he's going to keep the pictures in the Fortress of Solitude and that her husband won't mind because he doesn't seem like the jealous type. Okay. And then Lori dives back into the ocean, still without having said a word. And Lois says how sadly he's waving goodbye to her. I think I see tears in his eyes. He still loves her. Okay, fine. Superman flies off and tells the reader that he's going to zoom back into Clark Kent's cabin at super speed so that they won't notice him. Presumably they won't notice him anyway, since they've still got to fish for supper. But days pass, and days later we're in the newsroom of the Daily Planet, and Perry White, the editor, mentions that Clark Kent is out of town we're told that Clark Kent is out of town on an assignment, and coincidentally, while he's out of town, there's no sign of Superman in Metropolis, and Perry White is wondering if he's up to something special. And Lois says, well, I'll ask Jimmy Olsen, his friend. And Jimmy shows her a device that Superman gave him called a televiewer. It's in his apartment. This televiewer was given me by Superman himself. It can tune in on anyone, anywhere, and it can even pick up thoughts. He tunes in on Superman swimming down to Lori Lemaris' undersea world of Atlantis, where we see Superman and Lori and her husband. But I'm still concentrating on the televiewer, which allows Jimmy Olsen or any user to follow anybody, anywhere, and even read their thoughts. How does Superman have a secret identity? Jimmy Olsen has never tuned this televiewer in to follow Superman home. It's a little strange. It's one of these things that the writer of this piece, which is not credited, thankfully, would just come up with because it moves the plot along one panel. It only needs to move the plot along one panel. There has to be some way for Jimmy and Lois to see what's going on in Atlantis. So we invent this thing that blows apart the whole idea of not only secret identities, but also opens the possibility of Jimmy Olsen being the world's biggest perv. We're never going to hear of it again. We see them in Atlantis, Lori Lemaris, her husband Ronald, and Superman, when there is suddenly an accident. Superman is burrowing down into the ground for some reason. He's boring down out of view. No idea if that's a little dig at the artist for this issue. When a giant boulder is flung up out of the hole that Superman is making and strikes Ronald, Lori Lemaris' husband, fatally. He's dying. Jimmy Olsen actually says what any viewer would be thinking. Was it a coincidence that a boulder struck the merman married to the mermaid Superman loves? Or is it possible, Lois, that Superman deliberately... And Lois snaps at him. How dare you think such a terrible thing about Superman? Superman would never hurt anyone, and you know it, Jimmy. But whether the suspicion is merited or not, Ronald dies, but before he does, he bequeaths Lori Lemaris to Superman like she was Sevre China. He says, with my dying breath, I beg you, marry Lori. And that's his dying breath, but he goes on and on and on for several panels after that, telling Superman that Atlantean science can transform him into a merman so that he can be with Lori underwater. He can be with Lori anyway. He doesn't need to breathe. but anyway, Ronald even tells Superman, don't tell me that our science won't work on you because you're invulnerable. It will. And lo and behold, it does. Lois is out driving a boat when she sees Super-Merman, who calls Lori Lemaris to him. She finally speaks. I hear you, I am coming. He says, you loved Ronald, but he is gone. Marry me, Lori. It'll bring happiness into your life. And she says, yes, fate must have meant it to happen this way. And Lois is right there. she's climbed out of her boat onto the rocks. Where she anchors it or what she does with it, I don't know. And why they aren't a little bit surprised. And why is Superman standing on a rock if he's got a tail? But she's suddenly standing there, you know, like the ultimate Debbie Downer, and says, I'd like to wish both of you the very best happiness and luck. And Superman says, thank you, Lois. Lori and I will be often to think of you in our fortress of happiness in Atlantis. You've been a good friend. Goodbye, Lois. They dive off into the ocean. Okay, the drag race is over. Lois goes back to her apartment and cries. She doesn't have a good cry. She's got pictures of her time with Superman. That's going to have to do. She's got pictures. She's also got the televiewer in Jimmy Olsen's apartment that can watch Superman at any moment, at any time, and read his thoughts. It doesn't appear. I mean, we're told that the televiewer reads thoughts because the Atlanteans communicate telepathically. It has to be able to read thoughts. Otherwise, they would just be watching these people and not know what was going on. But if it can read thoughts, then it's going to be able to read the conclusion to the story, and it doesn't. It's just that the writer needed that one thing. That's all. The writer needed to be able to, for our characters to be able to watch Superman and narrate his activities under the ocean floor, under the water. Lois goes back to work at the Daily Planet. She says, Perry will never see Superman again. And Perry White says, I can't believe it. It sounds like a crazy fish story to me. Are you sure you haven't flipped, Lois? And when Brett Rand appears, Lois reads him the riot act. She says, I don't want any man. I don't want you. If I can't have Superman, I don't want anybody. And she's out driving when her car skids in front of a truck. And she is saved by Superman. No fishtail. She is saved by Superman. What? What happened to your fishtail? I mean, Superman tells her, my fish costume was fake and Ronald didn't die. And Lois says, you better give me an explanation. And Superman says, you'll get it soon. But he doesn't give it to her right away. Instead, he carries her car off to Jimmy's televiewer and shows us that the televiewer is also fake. What you saw on the screen were these films I prepared in advance with Lori and Ronald's cooperation. Jimmy and Perry were in on the hoax too. And that's a lot to ask the reader to believe. Lois only wants to know, why did you do it? And Superman says that the reason was that you had a very good offer from Brett Rand. I didn't want to stand in your way. If you knew I was taken, I assumed you would accept his offer. Because Superman says, I must put my duty to the world above love. I intend to let you know the truth after you are happily married to Brett, but you rejected him, and then I had to rescue you from that truck. Presumably, he would have rescued her from the truck anyway. There's no reason why Super-Merman couldn't rescue her from certain death on the highway. And we end the story with Lois thinking to herself, if Superman went to all that trouble, it proves I mean a lot to him. Maybe he'll marry me yet someday. So she hasn't learned anything. That's the end. Superman, the career of the Super-Merman was an attempt to get Lois to settle down with Mr. Right instead of pining after Superman, as she does in issue after issue in these comics. But it doesn't matter because, as we've covered in this week of comics, the whole point of the story was the cover. Here, let me show it to you again, just so you know. The whole point of the story was the cover. Superman is a merman? What? That's the whole point of the story. The cover. And the whole of the story is just one desperate, flailing rearguard action to come up with a story behind the cover. Now, I don't have any first-hand verification that this is true, but I think a lot of these things were generated that way. I think a lot of times somebody would come up with it, whether it was the editor or the writer or the artist, would come up with a wild cover illustration. Superman with a bug's head. Superman as big as a house. Superman as a bum with all his possessions and a stick over his shoulder or something like that. And then the writer would come up with a story for that. I don't know if that's the way. It would be the anti-Marvel method. But in either case, that was the way that you were supposed to enjoy this back in the halcyon days of 1960. Superman's a merman? Whoa. And that does it. That's this great issue of Superman from 1960. Caps our week of comic books, where I've been looking at comic book themes, comic book storylines, and even individual issues. So you've all been very long-suffering to put up with this. I'm going to bring it to a close now, unless it keeps going. Dun, dun, dun.